Welcome back, everyone. This is our bonus talk in the second round of Sit and Sips with Dr. Megan Rose. And in this latest series of talks, we've been diving deep into the topic that I really have dedicated over 20 years of my life to studying and practicing at this point, and that is the topic of spirit marriage. So for everyone who's been coming to these sit and sips every week or last fall, thank you so much for coming back. I really love doing these, and I love the fact that you show up and are enjoying and eager for the content. And if this is the first time with us live tonight or watching this as a replay, welcome. This is the final week of the Sit and Sip Stories of Spirit Marriage series that I've been doing this spring. And it really arose out of my years of research and practice as a practitioner scholar of esoteric spirituality and religion. So if you're interested in watching the previous Sit and Sips that I've done, you can see them all on my YouTube channel, which is Dr. Megan Rose, but I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. So you can also click that link. But for those of you that are watching this as a replay, you're watching it on my YouTube channel. So you're already there. Congratulations. You're one step ahead of everybody else. So today we're going to go for about an hour as usual, maybe a little bit longer because Monica and I have a lot to share and have a lot to unpack together, I think. And then at the end, if you stick around till the very end, I'll share some exciting news about offers and opportunities and things that are brewing in the world of spirit marriage. So I'm going to stay on at the end, and Monica will as well. If you have any questions you can put them in the chat, and I'll scroll through and look at them at the end, or you can just save them to the end and unmute yourself and ask them. All right. And just as a gentle reminder, I think most of you know the drill, but we keep our Zoom videos off and muted during the course of the conversation. And then at the end, you can unmute yourself and turn your videos on if you want. And that just helps with the recording of this for folks who watch this as a replay. So just a quick intro about me, if you're new to this series. I'm Dr. Megan Rose, and I have a doctorate in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I met Monica, our guest tonight. And I have a master's degree in religion and society from the Graduate Theological Union. So I'm also an initiated ceremonial magician, which we talked about last week. And I am a Shakta Tantric practitioner, and I'm a senior apprentice in the House of Bree Fairy Seership Institute. So those are kind of the waters that I swim in, both academically, scholarly, and as a practitioner. So tonight for our bonus talk, I kind of wanted to give you a feel for how I conducted all these co-researcher interviews that I've been exploring for the past 6 weeks. Because, all of the interviews began with questions that I couldn't answer for myself. When I started this research 15 years ago, I couldn't answer them myself. And so I compiled this list of like 17 questions that I asked my co-researchers, and they were things that I wanted to hear about their experience so I could try and figure out my own experience a little bit better. But all of these questions kind of centered around this one central question, which is, how do contemporary practitioners of spirit marriage experience their relationship with an otherworldly being? What does it look like for them? What does it look like in their tradition? How do they hold it? So I would start the interview and I would read this long list of 17 questions, and then I promptly would throw the questions out, and I would just say, okay, so that's sort of where we're going, but let's just set all that aside and have a relaxed, open-ended conversation and just allow the spirits to take us wherever they want to. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm not going to read through all the questions because Monica's already kind of seen them, and mostly I just want to know what's alive in this conversation tonight. So tonight I've invited, as I said, my friend and my colleague, Dr. Monica Mody, to share her story, Voice of the Kontomblé song. And Monica is a cowrie shell and a voice diviner in the West African Dagara tradition. And she has studied with elders, wisdom keepers, and medicine people from many healing traditions. And as a transdisciplinary poet, writer, educator, and a spiritual practitioner, her border-crossing praxis really lives at the intersection of earth-based wisdom, whole person philosophy, and embodied regenerative consciousness. Love that. I love that. Monica was born in Ranchi, India, and she lives in San Francisco, Ramaytush Ohlone territory. So welcome, Monica. I'm going to open up your mic and let's just dive in.
Thank you, Megan, for having me as a guest on your Sit and Sip. I am very honored and excited both to be here and be a part of these conversations and also to talk about the Kontomblé to, in some ways, bring a little window into that lineage, into that medicine amongst us.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really important for me to have someone who could speak from within the tradition, because although, as you know, and as I think I shared when I read Madron's story a few weeks ago, I have a little bit of exposure, but I'm not a practitioner. And so I wanted someone who could speak from within the tradition and who could sort of help elaborate on what it's like, what it's like to work in that tradition, what it's like to experience, as you so poetically put it, the voice of the Kontomblé song. So let's start there, right? Let's start with the Kontomblé and their song.
Yeah, and one of the most beautiful things that the Dagra work taught me was to begin always with the ancestors. So we're going to begin there. We're going to begin there by remembering that each one of us who is on the call and who sees the video later, we are embodiments of a lineage of blood and a lineage of spirit, right? Like there is an ancestral consciousness that is flowing through us. So really feeling that consciousness as it moves through our body, as it moves through our cells, and we are part of that river. It's not a static thing at all. It's a current. So really acknowledging those ones who are responsible for us being here in our multifaceted expression, and also acknowledging the earth we are on, or the larger earth that is our home, and also the land. Each of us is on a land, and maybe we were born there, maybe we came there as immigrants, as I did, right? And I want to acknowledge the land of my birth, Ranchi, as well, and the spirits of nature, who in the Dagra cosmology are all about magic and mystery, and that authentic knowing, that authentic flame that lives within us, and also the spirits of mineral, which is our bones and the stones, right? Like that connect us to that deep knowing that flows through the channels of the earth, and finally the spirits of water, which is flow and reconciliation and the medicine of healing and the deep medicine of that cleansed, pure consciousness that again connects us to our starry origins, which is where the Kontomblé come from in some ways, right? The Kontomblé is a name that the Dagara people gave to these beings that they have known, they have had relationships for thousands and thousands of years. And unlike many other parts of the world where these relationships were disrupted because of colonization, because of modernity, the Dagara people kept these relationships intact. But if we so and there are two parts of the story. One part is that we have entities or beings that are recognized, beings that have a similar consciousness that are recognized around the world, right? So you have the Menehune or the leprechauns or the Watitas. You have the Native American tribes here. You have the Huldu folk, but also in African lore. And again, when I say African lore, I am not from, well, unless we go back to deep ancestry. I was born in India, right? But to really acknowledge that in the oral tradition of Africa, West Africa in particular, but also other parts of Africa, there is this deep memory of these beings who came to Earth with that connection alive from there's the oral tradition speaks of the Sirius star system. So there are those lineages again to acknowledge that Kontomblé are bringing us medicine that is between the dimensions, that walks between the dimensions. There is the earthly dimension, and then there is a dimension of the cosmos, the starry origins that even in fairy lore, I know Orion Foxwood talks about it. That's where we come from, right? And the Kontomblé are walking in between. They're the in between people, in between beings, right? Like they're neither here nor there, and that allows them to be the conduit or the bridge of energy, the information. In many African cultures, the little people are supposed to be the bringers of civilization. They taught the sciences and the craft. They taught the Dagra people how to make beer, for instance, right? Like but the different ways in which the science of civilization comes down to humans. Kontomblé play a big role in that. So there's that intact tradition of the Dagra people, and then there is the African continent, right? Where again, these, for instance, amongst the Akan people, the little people are called the Moetias, right? So there's these knowings that there are these beings, ancient beings, with whom human beings have had a long established relationship, right? And then there's parallel civilizations of the Fae, the fairy beings, or and around the world, they're known by other names, and they're also culturally different, just like there are different cultures in the world. So that's one answer, right? And to the answer to the question song, because when you asked me how do we introduce this segment, somehow the Kontomblé didn't want me to say diviner. They didn't want me to say poet and diviner. And I feel like divination and poetry are two ways in which the that kind of information they want to encode often comes through in my practice, right? But they wanted me to specifically speak about the song, right? And the song, it lives in all of us. It lives in all of us, right? Like we're all part of that song. We are all that song, right? Like it's that one song which is the remembering, right? Like it's the remembering that's carrying us forward. It's the vibration, the vibration that's part of our being, right? Like we're thrumming with that song. So they wanted us to remember we are that song. We are that song. And the Kontomblé song is, yeah, they that's what they do. That's what they do. They're awakeners of that consciousness, which is already in us.
So beautiful. I'm feeling, Orion describes them as the delicious shivers. I'm getting a very strong somatic response as you're sharing this information. I mean, aside from like, my scholar brain, which is I'm like, oh yes, I know of stories in Manahuara or the Guatemalan Lenca tradition of the little builders that came from the stars and helped shape the early civilizations there, and just thinking transculturally of all these stories. But just aside from that, just the energy, the bhava, right? The somatic response of feeling the aliveness, and tasting that in you, and tasting that in the transmission of what you're sharing. So
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's how they speak, I mean, if you're not feeling that response somatically or emotionally, what's the point? The Kontomblé are again and again, come on, go there, go to the edge of what it means to be human and feel it all, experience it all. So yeah, that's one of the big things they want us to remember, that like there, that this kind of deadening that modernity often produces in us because of the linearity of relationships. It's not about that. It was never about that. So how do we get out of those grids, and how do we, you know, start feeling the delicious shivers? Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember if I shared this with you or not off screen, but I had recently had an acupuncture treatment with more of an esoteric acupuncturist that was working on post-traumatic stress disorder. I have some of that in my past history. And so we were doing this treatment, and I was sort of tasting into the different traumatizing events. And the biggest event that came up wasn't even a Megan personal event. It was the loss of the green world, right? It was the paving over, the creation of these urban environments that have stifled the life, the green world, the vitality of the planet. And there was just this deep trauma in my body, feeling that separation. And it really gave me pause at how deeply connected we are. Here I'm working on a trauma for myself, and I'm like, oh, one of my primal traumas, one of, I think, all of our primal traumas, whether we realize it or not, is this disconnection. So it really sounds like the Kontomblé are helping us reconnect in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And I can't, I resonate so strongly with that grief that you're naming too. And yeah, when grief really gets stuck, that's when it becomes trauma, right? And a lot of us, because we're perpetually within these environments without the ability to go and release, that's where the trauma is getting compounded too. But like like I feel that like in my being too. And yeah, it's interesting because the Kontomblé are all about, like the little people, right? Like, but also the little small ways in which consciousness lives in pockets in nature, right? Like, so nature is not one big monolithic system. It's all about very minute, minuscule, intricately linked together system. It's about those linkages, right? Like, so it's about those small connections, those subsystems that make up the larger systems that make up the larger systems, right? Like, even like thinking about systems thinking. So yeah, it's so there's a grief, but also the knowing that the the because they're so tiny, the little systems, that's what I'm hearing right now from them, that I mean, that because these systems are so small, they will never be able to be fully demolished, right? Like, they'll always find a way to be there. um yeah, so there's something we as humans also need to remember, right? Like, when we think we can replace nature in our anthropocentric consciousness, we can't, because again, the level at which they're working is so microscopic and so minute, right? Like, and it's the building blocks of life, right? Like, it's, where is it coming from? Yeah, that kind of information is not something we can reproduce. We can.
Yeah. Yeah. And we know that, like I've seen these gorgeous images of like abandoned buildings and abandoned cities where within just a few years, nature just breaks down and pokes through and takes over again. And I find that very inspiring and very hopeful that, we can only suppress it, we can only separate out for so long. And as Orion is fond of saying, we are all part of nature, right? We are nature beings that are never separate, right? That are never truly separate. And so I think that's part of where that grief came from. It's like I forgot, right?
Right, right. Yeah. Well, and also like, too, you know, because I feel like this was a gift that was given to me, right? Like came into the study with Maladoma, with the Dagra spiritual technologies, Dagra spiritual tradition, when I really needed that reconnection with nature myself, right? Like with the reconnection with my vileness. But I always try to remember this is not my ancestral tradition. So always to remember the conditions in which the teachings were carried forward, right? And the conditions in which these teachings were carried forward, the communities, in the way in which community operates in Africa, and is in the context of nature, right? Ritual happens in the context of nature. These relationships are not just born there, but even the modes of transmission come because everything is connected in that non-linear house of nature, right? Like, so there's singing and there's dancing and there's storytelling and there's drumming, and these are not, and rituals, right? Like, and these are not something that are tagged on. They are coming because even the mind, even the consciousness or the paradigm or the worldview that the culture is moving through is something that's coming out of that intact connection with nature. And then of course we superimpose the fact that we're experiencing globalization collectively and capitalism and what that does to, yeah, those connections. Yeah.
So that kind of leads me into, as you're talking about why or how the practices came to you at a time when you wanted to or needed to really reconnect to earth. Can you talk a little bit about, your entree into Dogger land and how that came about for you?
Yeah, I'd love to. So a PhD at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and at I remember what drew me to the doctorate program was again this like this thirst, right? Like this deep thirst for the what I would call right now is the tonic connection, right? Like that deep that connection with the river of life, right? Like which moves underneath it all. But I was trying different things. I came from a very traditional, conventional, in some ways secular background, but I came here and trying different things. And at some point this graduate course was offered as part of the program, where the course was structured around poetic participation, which is a term that the facilitator, the course facilitator, used to talk about Dagra spirituality. And so as soon as I read it, and again, it was at first, it was as though something opened in my mind first. It felt as though, again, there was like an opening. That's all I can describe it. I was like, I've always known this, and I need more of this. So I knew that there was this homecoming, and the word homecoming is something a lot of people talk about, when they come into contact with the teachings of Malidoma. So Dr. Malidoma Somé was my teacher, mentor, and he's an ancestor right now too. He passed away in December. He transitioned in December 2021, and I feel that so much is happening because he's actually at the in the ancestral realm, like telling a lot of us, okay, so what are you really doing with all of this, right? But Maladoma's work was all about reminding those of us who came from colonized or westernized backgrounds, here, remember who you are. right? So he would do it. His job, and his job that was given to him by his elders and ancestors, was to do it through the via media of Dagara spirituality, the Dagara path. But I believe eventually the job for all of us is to reconnect with our own ancestral, paths, and our own the land where we are, right? Like those are the original relationships. So anyway, there was that graduate course, and Maladoma came in as a guest lecturer, and again it was again every cell um, in my body was weeping.
Mhm.
I felt that immense sense of, where have you been? And where have you been, not to him, right? But like the kind of medicine that he was bringing forth. So I started the 2.5 year training, the Indigenous African Spiritual Technologies training with him. And where one went through, there was initiation into the different elements. There were different elemental rituals. There was working with cowrie shells and other, like that mode of divination, elemental mode of divination, which I also practice, and other technologies, ancestralization. Then he decided to bring the Kontomblé medicine here, which I don't think he had offered in the Bay Area for a long time. And at first, I wasn't, it didn't click for me. It didn't click for me because I was like, what is this weirdness? Another kind of strangeness, right? And I still remember I was taking a walk with an elder, and he's like, you're a poet, you should consider this. And so somehow he had this understanding, right, that that put me on this path. And yes, the Kontomblé consciousness is very deeply connected to the poetic consciousness. In fact, Federico Garcia Lorca actually wrote an essay about the duende, and he talks about duende as an aesthetic experience, right? But the duendes are also beings in Andalusia, right? So there was already, there are examples, right, like of that kind of parallel consciousness. So I went for the Kontomblé initiation, the Kontomblé merger, without completely knowing why I am going, but I also trusted that, like something was steering me in that direction. And yeah.
Yeah, that it's so interesting because that's really common when with spirit marriage, where an elder in the community will often either be approached by the spirit that wants to marry you, or will see that the marriage needs to happen. When we talked with Orion Foxwood a few weeks ago, we talked about how he was having this relationship with Bree, and it was like she was this powerful fairy, powerful nature spirit, and he was fine and dandy with just her being a guide. And then she appears to Dolores Ashcroft Noishki and is like, I want to marry Orion, and he's like, I don't know what I'm getting myself into. But I heard that story again and again, so I think that's a pretty common way for people to enter, at least when they're sitting within a tradition or they have access to a tradition. Sometimes the spirits just come of like with me, they just sort of, okay, we want to marry you. And then I had to figure out what all of that meant. Hence this research. Yeah. Yeah. So so the Kontomblé, but there are other spirits. With Madron's story, we talked about Tingan. So there are other spirits that one can merge with in the Dagara cosmology. Do each of the mergers indicate a certain function or a certain outcome that one, like a job or a kind of relationship that's tended?
Absolutely. Um, Absolutely. There are many, many different kinds of roles, right? And many different kinds of sobs, as you would call them. Um, a few years ago, I had gone down to what is the East Coast village up in um, Massachusetts, and they had many more different shrines and shrine keepers. But also, it's interesting because these are again, we've transposed them here, right? Like we've transposed them. They're the cosmology or the worldview that people, the Dagara people, come from Burkina Faso, right? Like it's from Maladoma, came from a village called Dano. But the Dagara people are themselves moved from Ghana, right? So these are transposed relationships. So imagine these are happening there, right? And because that's a cosmology we're trying to connect with here, we are bringing these relationships in our midst in a far more fragmented fashion, and it can only be that because we're not Dagara, right? Like we're not that, to really recognize that, right? Like this is a gift. So can we carry it? Yeah, for me, that awareness is always there. It's a gift. So can I carry it knowing that this is a gift? It came at the time when, for me, it brought that medicine of wildness, right? Like that medicine of pattern disruption. Kontomblé are pattern disruptors, right? Like, and and disruption, but also the original energy of creation is also how they um, that's the song, right? Like the original energy of creation is also the song. So they're that. So the medicine comes to whoever's, you know, bringing forth a particular expression of that medicine as needed. But also we have to recognize that we're, in some ways, this is transplanted medicine, right? So that dichotomy is always there. But it's Maladoma made it work. And we're going to see how far we're going to, we can continue moving with this medicine with authenticity and integrity in future. So
yeah, so it's like a transplanted and translated, right? It has to be this translation, right, with the beings that were already here that maybe serve as a similar function. I talk about it a lot when we're talking sort of cross pantheon or cross tradition, how there may be, in this case, spirits of nature, but the nature that they manifest and the nature that they represent and govern are different geographically, right? Like a mountain versus a water versus a desert. And so they may have the sort of umbrella function of nature spirit, but then they have these sort of subcategories. Or the example I like to use is like a police officer. We understand that a police officer in general upholds the law, right? But how a police officer functions in San Francisco versus Ranchi, India, versus Burkina Faso versus Ireland, they have different laws, right, and different cultural contexts that they're beholden to. And so it's sort of like, what's this translation project between those conditions, when you're sort of, say, bringing a function out of one culture and then contacting through that system in a different culture. It's a really interesting.
and that project of translation happens at another level too, actually at the level of language as well, right? Because we're speaking in English, right? And the linguistic ecology that these beings are originally a part of is completely different. It actually, the metaphors are different, the images are different, and yeah, in yeah, and metaphors are different. I'll just leave it at that. It just creates like a completely different world altogether, because language has world building properties too. So.
It's why I think, as you going back to what you're talking about around the somatics, it's why I think the felt sense, right, is so important, because the felt sense is often a priori of language, right, a priori of visuals even. It's and it's a deeper language. And if we can really tune in through our emotional body, right, we have maybe a closer taste to that vibration, or that resonance.
Yeah, yeah. Which is why ritual is so important to this, this ritual, and yeah, just because it bypasses the mind. It bypasses all those things that are between the civilized veneer and the primordial, the core, right? Like the primal core of being. It that will get affected if you allow it to, right? And which is why it's such a threatening mode of being too, right? Like to a lot of like also to shine a light on yeah how I'm thinking of I won't name that philosopher, but there are these hierarchical models of tradition, spiritual tradition, right? Like, and so the African or the tribal modes are supposed to be in these hierarchical schema below, right? But I would say that that's because there is an implicit threat to that civilized veneer, right? This kind of a very like a body based, like a response that tears you and puts you inside out. What Kontomblé medicine really does, and ritual medicine, is it yeah, it upturns you, right? Like it's really about like bringing out also those hidden or dark facets of you, which you would want to, your civilized brain would want to put inside the closet, shut it, lock away, throw away the key, right? And this is what colonization turned demonic, or turned or this is where the labeling started, right? Because they knew that if when people have access to this kind of power and connection with nature, that's a threat to the mode of control, the authoritativeness with which colonization establishes itself as the so to recognize the role that Western education and colonialism have played, also in stigmatizing these technologies and tradition. And I'm aware of it because I grew up in a fairly like I said, like in some ways secular and educated environment, and these were not easily available to me as a woman growing up in a conventional middle class family, right? Like these pose a risk to that, and that risk is that risk is I won't use my scholars speak too much, but it's that subaltern risk, right? Like it's that risk. The ruling class always has known that the ones who they're trying to rule have access to these subaltern forms of spirituality and connection. Yeah.
It's very threatening to claim that you have or to practice, right? An animist tradition which says my spiritual gnosis, right, is just as valid. And, stepping onto the platform of ritual as self-cultivation and as co-creative practice with the otherworldly powers that be, right, is very destabilizing to that sort of top-down religion that wants to tell you how to do things and wants to tell you what the truth is and wants to tell you this proscribed set of things to stay within the fold and to stay within these sort of narrowly defined ways, and in essence, to control, right, to control you. And so to practice animism, to practice this sort of re-enchantment of ourselves nested within
Mhm.
cosmos, right, nested within Gaia, that puts us as a co-participant, right, and or a lover even to
Mhm.
the planet, and not in this sort of anthropocentric, I'm telling, I'm dictating, right, what's going on, but more I'm listening, and I'm in that dance, and I'm in that, that juicy, place of being open and flexible. um you step out of being able to be controlled so easily.
Exactly, exactly. It's that uncontrollable nature of it,
Yeah.
and it comes out. Credo Mutwa, who was a South African medicine man, he has this beautiful interview where his terms are mother knowing versus, I think he calls it warrior knowing, right? Warrior knowing is knowing how to get from here to there, but mother knowing is like, oh, that tree is a living entity, right? Or the stone will um, reveal to me all the mysteries of the earth, right? So it's gnosis. But once you have access to, uh, it's a completely different um, access to knowing, right? Um, and it's not just within, because it'll also show up in relationships outside.
Mm.
So that's where, yeah, that's why by demonizing it, they're controlling it. So
Exactly, because then all of a sudden we're afraid. I like to say the church, and I'm going to talk about Christianity specifically here, but Christianity says, talk to spirits. Talk to spirits if they're Jesus, if they're the Holy Spirit, if they're angels, maybe you're okay. The saints are probably okay if you're Catholic, maybe not so much if you're a Protestant, but so our spirits are okay, and everything else is evil, is demonic. You need to be afraid of it. And that is, it's this us versus them. It's this division, and ultimately it's this huge divorce from our body as nested within Gaia consciousness.
yeah, yeah. And something that Maladoma talked a lot about was how this separation that you're naming, it created classes of people who were diagnosable,
Mm.
right? Like the people who were assumed to have mental health problems,
Right.
right? Um, and a lot of them didn't have the initiatory containers that they would otherwise have available in indigenous cultures, where again, it's these different, crisscrossing, bidirectional, non-linear, non-binary modes of knowing are recognized as valid, completely valid, right? Um, and he would talk about, Maladuma would talk about why, um, in the West in particular, these Kontomblé initiations helped people make that bridge, right? Like especially people who would otherwise be classified as mad or crazy, one of those or any of those DSM definitions, right? But what these mergers and initiations could do is they could allow people who had access to those frequencies to work with them slowly in a more integrated way. So
yeah, there's a very fine line between Saint Teresa and the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, who's having these very erotic encounters with an angel, and someone like, say, Ida Craddock, who was an early 20th century erotic mystic who was having erotic relationships with an angel. And here Saint Teresa is sainted and Ida Craddock is thrown in an asylum and eventually, dies for her practice. And so it's interesting how that control, right, is used to, as you were saying, define what's in, what's out, what's us versus them, what's good versus bad, et cetera, et cetera. So many directions that we could go in. I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that this practice has, and your merge. I mean, we could go into like, if you want to, we could go into like, what was that like for you? How did things shift for you before and after? And was there sort of a ritual container around the merge? We could go there. We could also go into like, what are the benefits? What might be the cautions? Where would the Kontomblé like us to search now? Or something else that you might want.
well, I'll share that, I wasn't completely ready for what happened. And it's because for me, the process was more gradual. Like for some people, the merger happened in community, and for some people were ready. That switch for them flipped immediately. For me, it took a while for that switch to flip. It was a gradual process, and I remember when it happened, I had not made agreements with them, right? Which is, again, I think, like really, really critical to this practice. I'm sure you've talked about this with other practitioners as well, right? Like, it's a partnership, right? Like it's the your needs and your physical, emotional, psychic, energetic integrity is as important as what the Kontomblé are trying to do through this partnership, right? So yeah, I hadn't somehow, because that I could feel it, but I had no idea the intensity would be that much, right? Like when they moved in, and they moved in when I was out with in a women's circle, in a new moon circle, and suddenly I was like, oh, where am I? Right? Like it was very disturbing in a way, because again, like this is when it's not mediated, right? It really that we talked about like that madness, right? Like, but it really can feel like that, right? The frequencies are completely different from these normal human frequencies at which we're operating, right? Like right now, the channels at which we're communicating right now, those are completely different channels. So it was very unnerving, and I remember that was that being as like a big learning experience, that I was like, okay, we need to learn how to work together, and we need to craft agreements. And how are you going to show up when you really need to attract my attention? What are you going to do, right? So yeah, I'm going to name that as like a big learning that happened for me. And also, I in 2018, I decided to have like a second merger with them, which was like a private ritual. And yeah, it happened. It was very, very small. You couldn't make it. I know you were not able to make it. And I felt like that was needed because the first one was more the first merger with them that happened in community. I kind of came in there as an innocent, right? I was like, what is this? I don't completely know, but I'm going to show up. But the second merger was more intentional. And I really wanted to make that recommitment because yeah, there are many different directions. I think some people would say that, you can only be a diviner, or it can only show up in life in this way. But I think it's about um it's that level of creativity and magic and synchronicity that can show up via you in a plethora of ways, right? So I wanted to really re-articulate those commitments and do it in a way that felt like it would ground me in my body and being again. And it was really good to do that. It was really good to do that. And because the Dagra culture, again, it's Dagra tradition. It's not an intact tradition that you're getting, right? Like Malidoma brought in a big piece of that medicine. Sabon Fu Sume brought in another piece of that medicine. And there's so much, there's pieces of knowing and knowledge that if you really want to know, you either go work with these energies or these entities yourself, which is where your gnosis comes into play, right? Or you go to other wisdom keepers or elders who've been working with them for a long time and who have their relationship. So I remember I did a lot of that in 2018, where I was really like, okay, I need to know more. I need to know more. And it was really good to kind of like do that exploration again. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you receive, even though you do divination yourself, you receive divination from others in the community, and it sounds like the community can really support each other that way by upholding the different, functions. And is there a reason why you would go to one diviner versus another, as far as like the role that they play or the beings that they're divining with or for?
Um, I think every diviner has very specific information to impart, or people know. Yeah, I would say trust for people who are interested, right? If you're feeling resonance with someone's energy and someone's way of being, trust that. Yeah, like it's the Dagra way, and what Maladoma always encouraged us is to trust that non-rational knowing, that trust that click, trust that click, trust that click, right? Like, and also trust that you are being steered by your ancestors. They're there to guide you. They're there to guide you. But yeah, I've always either had a clear yes to working with someone or not working with someone, right? Like, so I just trust that.
I guess another way of saying it is you do both Kontomblé voice divination and cowrie shell divination. How would one decide, well, I want a Kontomblé divination or a cowrie shell divination? Do they have different outcomes, or are they asking different questions, or is it just a different way of getting at information?
I'll give a poetic response because that's all that is possible.
Okay.
You either feel a click,
Mm.
or sometimes when somebody comes to me, I know the Kontumble practice. It's more of a direct knowing, right? Like it's like you're actually talking to them. So you have to be ready to have someone be a vessel for those kinds of frequencies. The cowrie shells, there is a mediation happening via things like bones and stones and cowrie shells, and there's a medicine wheel, so that it becomes sort of like a place where the energies get translated first. So it's easier, I think, like it's more digestible, but it's just one answer. Like that answer can probably turn completely upside down
Mm,
in
mhm.
another context.
I see. So, to like maybe like put it in something that folks in the West might recognize more as maybe it more like going to tarot versus going to somebody who's channeling.
Yeah, but this is we're talking about different paradigms altogether.
Totally different paradigm.
We're
Yeah.
talking about different paradigms altogether.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I would say read or talk about it and just trust what you're led to. And if you don't know, again, every answer I'm giving to you is provisional, Megan. So
Right.
if you perhaps you would want to begin with cowrie shell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know when I first encountered the Dagara land practices, it was through Cowrie divination.
yeah.
And then through the Cowrie divination, the Kontomblé showed up and were like, we want to talk to her. And so then I received Kontomblé divination from that. But that was sort of an interesting, the entry was just sort of through these divinations, and I would go and the shells would tell me, or the
Right.
spirits would say, you need to do this ritual and this ritual and this ritual, and I would go off for a few months and do the rituals and then come back, and they're like, okay, so this is what you do next. And it was like this prescription. And then eventually, once I'd done enough of these rituals, the Kontomblé started coming through and wanting to talk to me more directly.
Yeah, yeah. And that can be a path for many people, just because it's easier, right? Like it's somehow that mediation makes it.
Hmm, hmm.
And maybe people are just ready. Yeah, you'll
Yeah.
know. You'll
Yeah,
know. Mm.
yeah. That was one of the interesting things that happened, was the diviner that I was working with at the time was like, well, this is interesting. Normally the ancestors come through first, and normally the ancestors have all this stuff, but the Kontomblé were there, and the Kontomblé were like, nope, we want to talk to her first, and we want, her to do this, and this. So he was like, this is what we're gonna do, because this is what they're saying. I'm just noticing the time, and I'm wondering if there is anything that that you would say, the sort of the the missive, or
Mm.
the the mission of the Candomblé, right, with humanity at this time. What why, what is the purpose, what are they wanting us? I mean, we've talked about reconnecting with nature and sort of rewilding ourselves. um are there other things that they are wanting to co-create, or to bring to the awareness of humans?
Yeah, I think they really want us to remember who we are.
Mm.
They really want us to just remember who we are, because we are not what we've been told, right? Like that what modernity has told us. And yeah, this that consciousness that the invitation they extend, we open up to. It's really like that pattern, that flower of life pattern, right? Like that pattern which is just extending outward. It's this beautiful, intricate weave and web. Thinking also of the image that you used to talk about this talk, or the bees, right? Like the bee medicine. It's that, like it's this deep remembering of the building blocks and of life itself, right? Like, and these are not just for us, because again, even though the Kuntumle can really be very much about, a part of them is like, you humans just need to, pull yourself by the bootstraps and just get on with it, right? Like, but they're also invested in us, right? And the investment is because there is that forgetting impacts them because they are our original ancestors too in the Dagra cosmology. So thinking back to how we started with the ancestors, and we, those of us living right now, we are the future ancestors, and who comes after us, it's the future generations that come after us, right? Like, so that continuity and that link, it is about that, those links, right? So they are all about those the re-enlivening of those portals, right? Like those portals that connect us to these mysteries where we remember what the building blocks are. And these building blocks of life, that's what they're saying again and again, building blocks of life, right? Like these are, yes, they're in nature, yes, they're outside, and they're here, they're in like biologically they're within our DNA, but also they're in the consciousness itself, right? Like the sacred geometry of consciousness. So they're all about remember who you are, and there is no one answer to this, right? Like the brain will want to know, give me the answer, but it's like they're saying it's not, there's no one answer. You have to remember the multifaceted, complex answer this is, because that's what the future generations deserve. That's what the future generations deserve, that we remember that fullness of our divinity, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful. Is there anything else that you or the Kontomblé would like to share today as we draw to a close?
No, I think this feels good. It's yeah, I think they also want people to remember that this is one medicine path, right? Like there's like many paths to come back to these knowings, and what they're really asking each one of us to do is to come into right relationship with what's around us, um, with our own particular configuration, our own configuration of family and ancestral lineage and spiritual lineage and land, right? Like they're all about like don't again, don't look, um, begin with where you are and write those relationships and reconcile those relationships,
Yeah,
and everything else will,
yeah.
like a beehive, right? Like it's going to begin, it's going to begin from here, like the flower of life pattern.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. And one of the, the best ways that I encourage people is to like know whose land you're on, right?
Yes.
Those of us that who are here in the West, and I loved in your intro, when you talk about being on, we're here on the land of the Yalamo Rametu Shaloni people, and many of us are not born here, and so we are inheriting the spirits of the land. And so just using something as simple as the Native Lands app or website and finding out who the people are there, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do have I did want to share that if anyone who's listening is moved, and would like to offer a donation to a couple of different nonprofits, just because this is a gift, right? Like the Dagra teachings are a gift. So I just want to acknowledge and honor also that one of them is Aviela, and Aviela. And if you go to malidoma.com, it's a nonprofit that was started by him. I can also put it out for
Yeah.
you. But it's a nonprofit that specifically is about respecting and honoring the diviners and the wisdom keepers and the medicine carriers. And he wanted this to become like thriving, you know, um, organization that fulfills that purpose, right? Like of keeping those teachings alive in the West, in particular, keeping that medicine alive. And the other shout out that I'd like to give to is to dagralegacy.com, dagralegacy.com. That is a fund and a project started by my friend Susan Manchester, who is also she's a diviner in Boulder, and she has been really helping this the people in this Dagara village build things. Like there's a garden. She helped them buy a tractor, and right now they're collecting funds for to build a birthing room for the village there. So if anyone is moved, please feel free to look these two up, and yeah, bless
Thank you.
them.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica, for the chat tonight. I'm such a fan of you and your work, and so it's been such a blessing to have you share about your practice and share about the Dagara lineage. It's such a powerful reconnective tool that we've been blessed with here in the United States, and I don't know if it's been taken to other parts of the world other than Burkina Faso, but it is
Oh,
really.
absolutely. Maladoma did so much, did beautiful work in like taking it to many different parts of the world. And thank you. It is, I equally admire you and adore you, and I'm so excited for your book to be out in the world. And so, like such an honor again to be a part of this conversation.
Someone is asking if you could type the second link in there as well, so that they can go find that. So you can learn, Monica's going to put that in the text, and you can also learn more about Monica and the work that she does as a poet and a diviner at drmonicamody.com. And I put the URL in the chat there. It's drmonicamody.com. So we're going to wrap things up. I just wanted to remind everyone that my book is coming out. Spirit, Marriage, Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings is coming out in a week and a half. On Tuesday, April the 5th. And like I mentioned last week, I'm asking folks, I have a special request. I would really love to get Amazon bestseller status. My publisher really wants me to get Amazon bestseller status. So if, folks that are open to it, if you would buy my book on April 5th on Amazon, I'm giving a free gift away of a couple free gifts. Actually, if you do that, you can get a free MP3 recording of me reading my story, and you'll get a ticket to my book release party, which is happening on Thursday, the 21st of April, a few weeks later. So the way you do it is you buy the book on the release day, April 5th, and then you take your order number and your email address, and you go to my website, spiritmarriage.com, which I'm going to put in the chat here as well. And you can enter that on, input it there, and then you'll get an audio recording of me reading my chapter, The Erotic Mystic, Part 1, Journey to My Divine Self. That's the recording. And you'll also be guaranteed a ticket to my book release party. And the book release party is going to be just kind of a fun celebration. I'm going to have some door prizes, some giveaways, and hopefully some surprise guests. So if you could put it on your calendar, April 5th, and then head over to the Spirit Marriage website for that offer. And then just one final reminder that my first Spirit Marriage book talk through the East West Bookshop in Mountain View is next week on Wednesday, the 30th of March. And this is a fundraiser for the Ukraine. I'm going to be donating all the proceeds from it to the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, which a Ukrainian friend of mine told me is just an amazing organization that's getting funds directly on the ground there in Ukraine to help folks and getting it to where it needs to be. So please consider coming, buying a ticket. It's going to be online, so you can attend from anywhere. And you can find it if you go to the eastwestbooks.org. For those of you watching this as a replay, you can get the ticket there, but I'm also putting a link in the chat right now. All right. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for everyone who stayed till the end, watched till the end. And Monica and I are going to stay on now for a few minutes to see if there's any questions or respond to any comments that you have. But, thank you everyone who came week after week. I hope to see you all at my book party on the 21st. And, make sure to follow me if you're not on Instagram and Facebook. I'm at drmeganrose.com, or you can go to spiritmarriage.com. You can sign up for my email list there to get all my updates. And actually, I just created a new freebie. So when you sign up at spiritmarriage.com, you'll get a free download of a little piece that I wrote about the 3 keys to spirit marriage as my little thank you for joining my email list. So that is it for the presentation portion tonight. I am gonna stop the recording here and sign off, but we will stay on and chat with anybody who wants to ask questions tonight. So much love.